Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 99 for the week ending April 20, 2018. The banks are still behaving badly episode. Now, a word about our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, Inc. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally across all industries. With their knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 700 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit Affiliated Monitors website at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. Today, Jay and I are back with the week's top ethics and compliance stories. Obviously, the Wells Fargo $1 billion fine is going to be significant, and we'll discuss that. We have some comments by Michael Held, the General Counsel and Executive Vice President of the Legal Group at the New York Fed, about the 3 lines of defense. We have a new Assistant DAG, Matthew Milner, who has said that in a private practice, he wants to cut back on the Yates Memo. Will he do so while he's on the DOJ team? We have a sentencing, or proposed sentencing, of an FCPA violator that Dick Casson reports on. ZTE reminds us that if you're under a DPA and you lie to the DOJ, you're in big trouble. We have another guilty plea in the ongoing PDVSA corruption case. And Rick Messick asks, will DPAs work outside the United States? We explore that topic. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode of This Week in FCPA with my colleague Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors. This week, we're on episode 99 for the week ending April 20th, 2018, the banks are still behaving badly edition. We had some, I thought, wide variety of compliance and ethics stories this week. So, Jay, why don't we just hop right into it? And our lead topic today is, amazingly enough, Wells Fargo. So what is Wells Fargo up to today in the breaking news category?
Well, in the breaking news, they've just been levied with a penalty of $1 billion with a B dollars, and it's being imposed by both the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. What's interesting about this is coming from the same regulatory body that President Trump has been asking to dismantle several banking rules and have a regulatory rollback, because in the president's mind, the banks are not lending enough money out there. And I'm not sure if the facts really support that, because there's a number here, Tom. I don't know where it is, but there is been a lot of money that's been out there that the banks have made available to loans right now. In terms of Wells Fargo's trouble, we go back to September 2016 when they paid a fine of $185 million, and that was for opening up false and new credit cards in customers' names without them knowing. And then furthermore, the fines kept on coming. And also in 2006, the Justice Department levied almost $1.5 billion in fines and penalties against the bank for offenses ranging from punishing white whistleblowers unlawfully to repossessing the cards of our military heroes. So in Trumpian fashion, the president tweeted yesterday, fines and penalties against Wells Fargo Bank for their bad acts against their customers and others will not be dropped, as has incorrectly been reported, but will be pursued and, if anything, substantially increased. I will cut regs, but make penalties severe when caught cheating, exclamation point. So not a good place to be this Friday morning at Wells Fargo. What are your thoughts on this, Tom?
So they just can't seem to get it right, Jay. Here we are a couple of years after the original scandal. They have subsequently had a very severe sanction of put on them by the Fed regarding their growth because they were unwilling or unable to change not only their tone at the top, but the requirements for risk management. So they really, it's hard to understand the number of continuing FUBARs they've had, although it maybe just defaults back to what Warren Buffett says, if there's one cockroach in the kitchen, or there's never one cockroach in the kitchen. And because of the structures they had in place, incentive programs they had in place, the architecture of the organization with its siloed nature, really nobody had visibility across all business lines. They just ran rampant in these fraudulent activities. So, maybe the bank will turn it around. The bank itself, I found it most interesting that certainly most people are focusing on the number 1 billion, and rightly so as a fine and penalty. But the financial cost of Wells Fargo has been significantly more catastrophic. They've lost a large percent or some percentage of their market cap during the same time frame when J.P. Morgan, for instance, had a multiplier of, I think, 10 or so. Wells Fargo is down in the single digits. Their costs for the defenses of these various fraudulent activities is, I think, estimated at $4.5 billion, and that has driven down their profits even more. So the cost to the bank for its failure to really do business ethically and in compliance with its own internal controls is really catastrophic, and it really drives home the point that the cost is not the fine and penalty. The cost is your pre-settlement investigation cost, your post-settlement remediation cost, and for Wells Fargo, the loss of profits. So we can hope that this will be one of the last major fines and penalties against the bank. Let us hope that there are not additional fines and penalties levied, but it's certainly something that I think everyone's going to pay attention to. On the political side of the house, it's going to be interesting to see now whether the administration will point to this particular fine and say, see, we're serious about finding people and gut the rest of the organization, CFPB, or they will use this to look at other wrongdoers. So going to be interesting to see the political fallout. But from the compliance perspective, lots of lessons learned. Once you start looking, you're liable to find lots of different things. The board certainly has come under significant criticism, and rightly so. We can only hope that Wells Fargo will start to pay attention to compliance at the board level and ethics as well. And my suggestion, as I've said several times, is to put a compliance professional on the board. But we'll just have to see whether Wells Fargo can pull itself out of this.
So next up, we have a keynote address by Michael Held that was given recently at the, I'm not familiar with this one, Tom, the 1LOD Summit. And Mr. Held works at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Right. So, Jay, I pulled this one because I thought it was interesting. The three lines of defense are generally recognized to be the frontline troops, your operational management. Line two is your compliance and legal functions. And then line three is your internal audit function. And what Michael Held has asked us to think about is certainly within the context of those three lines, don't make them silos. So have visibility across all three lines and really work to operationalize all three lines. Essentially, it's don't miss the forest for the trees, but he talks about it in lots of different ways, such as diversity, such as your architecture. And that was, I think, something that many companies had really not considered until Wells Fargo, with their very siloed business unit nature. Obviously, incentives is important to consider, but Mr. Held points out that it's not simply about financial incentives, and he pointed directly to the LIBOR scandal, where he found incentives other than financial drove some of the scandals. Then he has a section on moral reasoning. This is what Dov Seidman, I think, from LRN would call moral courage, to really step up and do the right thing. And I thought it was a really interesting article. It's, as you may guess, from someone who works at the New York Fed, aimed at bankers, but it has a lot of applicability to the general compliance practitioner and how you think through your role and the roles of all others in your company for operationalizing compliance. So, Jay, next up, we have yet another new Deputy Assistant Attorney General who's overseeing the Criminal Division's fraud section. It's a fellow named Matthew Milner, and he had said some things in private practice about giving corporations more of a pass and, quote, clarifying, end quote, parts of the Yates Memo, which really just seemed to me to be denuding the Yates Memo. But what was your take on this?
I think part of it is a stick and part of it is a carrot. And the part that I like that he brought up was he thought that there is one thing the department could do to really incentivize investments in this space is to make compliance programs and their effectiveness and adequacy of these programs super factors. So on one side of his mouth, he's arguing that the time to really be investing in ethics and compliance is on the front end, because you can really use this as a risk management tool, and you can also incentivize it as to how to keep the companies on their toes and benchmarked with the proper programs out there. But I'm a little bit confused with his confusion with the Yates Memo and exactly how that plays with individual culpability. So the one interesting thing is that the recent remarks by Rod Rosenstein has also said that he wants to clarify the ambiguities in the Yates Memo. And then in March, he also said that he wants to reward companies that invest in strong compliance measures. So I think, part of it is really good about looking at the preventative nature of ethics and compliance programs that are robust and have teeth in them. But at the same time, I'm worried about watering things down with the Yates Memo.
So let me leave aside the issue of just giving corporations a pass. That's a typical Chamber of Commerce position. But this is not unusual in the following, Jay. We see lawyers in private practice make arguments all the time. I would point you to Andrew Wiseman, who wrote a paper for the Chamber of Commerce setting forth a desire to have a compliance defense. And that completely changed once he got on the team with the DOJ, and he became one of the strongest prosecutors of companies around in his role in overseeing the fraud section. And so I don't think you can, certainly SEC Chairman Jay Clayton directly criticized FCPA enforcement in private practice, and his tune has completely changed. These guys don't go in here to not prosecute companies. I just completely discount this. It's a lawyer speaking for his client before he got behind the DOJ's team, and now he's on the team, and now he's going to prosecute. That's sort of point one. Point two is, if he's going to change things, he's got to change the U.S. Attorney's Manual. And this is not the Minor Memo. This is not clarification of the Yates Memo. This would be a change in policy, which means it has to go all the way up to be approved, literally up to the vetted up to the AG's level. So it was a speech hosted by the Federalist Society, and he's speaking to an audience there that wants to hear that. And so I completely discount this. Super factors. That changes a sentencing guidelines. That requires congressional approval. And as you can tell, I don't really put any stock in it.
Okay, so next up, we have something from Richard Casson in the FCPA blog. Feds seek 40-month FCPA sentence for Florida telecoms chief. What's that about?
So this is a continuing saga of in Miami, where we have people who paid bribes to get telecom services or contracts rather for telecom companies in Aruba. And we had a U.S. citizen involved in this who I think has pled guilty to paying or part of a conspiracy to pay bribes. So we've had one guilty plea previously, and we've got a couple of folks coming up to be sentenced. So it's going to be interesting to see what the sentence is. This is someone who's pled guilty and apparently cooperated. A 40-month sentence is certainly nothing to scoff at. The other interesting thing about this, Jay, was this was not a self-disclosure, but this was really exposed in 2016 through the Panama Papers when it was revealed that the product manager for the state enterprise in Aruba turned out to own shell companies or offshore companies, and he was named in the Panama Papers. So it shows once again where great journalism in helping to put the light of day on offshore entities has led to criminal convictions. So we're going to have to see where this may go.
All right, next up, we have another story from FCPA blog, and it's about the Chinese telecom company ZTE, and they have replaced their chief compliance officer after admitting to the U.S. government in March that it made false statements about meeting the requirements of their settlement agreement. And this gentleman, on Wednesday, ZTE removed Chen Gang, a senior vice president, from the role as chief compliance officer and chief legal officer, according to an internal human resources notice dated March 8th. And China is now, ZTE is China's biggest listed telecommunications equipment maker. And on Monday, they were served with a 7-year denial of export privileges by the U.S. Department of Commerce for failing to comply with the settlement terms in an earlier sanction agreement. And this bases back in 2017, ZTE paid a $1.19 billion fine to settle criminal charges for selling equipment to Iran and North Korea. And as part of the settlement, they've promised to fire 4 senior executives and discipline 35 others. And in fact, they did fire the 4 senior employees, but they continued to have those others still being employed by the company, and they were actually paid full bonuses and failed to be issued any reprimands. So I guess we file this one under that you really shouldn't lie to the regulator because they're going to come back and bite you.
Yeah, in my last corporate position, Jay, I was with a company that was under deferred prosecution for its FCPA sins, and they pulled this. They were not honest with the regulators, then the DOJ, and the DOJ was not happy. And I tell the story that, and I was never sure why they were so unhonest with the DOJ, if the owners were also foreign outside the United States. And it was never clear to me if it was because they just didn't understand, there was some language gap, some cultural misunderstanding. But I liken it to the following. As a teenage boy, I engaged in certain behaviors that I would ask for forgiveness after I'd engaged in said behaviors. as the father of a teenage girl, my views evolved somewhat, where I wanted to know beforehand what the behavior was, rather than after it occurred. So perhaps they've had an evolutionary awakening as well at ZTE. The sanction, though, is just stunning, and that's a 7-year denial of export. So that basically cuts them off from the American market, and that is catastrophic. So much more than a $1.19 billion fine. So they've now got to manufacture everything in the United States. So who knows where this will take the company? But it is, and the other point I would raise in the general political climate of Trump's trade wars, is China going to now retaliate in some way? I leave that as an unanswered or open question. Nevertheless, this is catastrophic for ZTE, and it really drives home the point you started with, which is the regulators do not like to be lied to. And if you're a non-U.S. company out there thinking, well, I'll just say I'm sorry and didn't understand, that that's not going to cut it going forward.
So, Tom, you have often said that Houston is the center of the FCPA world. Why don't you tell us what Henry Cutter wrote about our good friends at PDVSA?
So Henry Cutter at the Risk and Compliance Journal at the Wall Street Journal yesterday reported that another guilty plea has come down in the massive PDVSA ongoing corruption scandal. This one was Cesar Rosen, and Cesar's brother, Roberto, had previously pled guilty, but Cesar was a part of the PDVSA purchasing team called the management team, and they literally solicited vendors. I wouldn't say extorted, but they certainly solicited vendors for bribes and kickbacks in exchange for providing those vendors assistance with their PDVSA business. The assistance was to get contracts and to get information about response to RFPs and to jump ahead of others in the payment line. This was not a $10,000 or $20,000 sort of help. This was help that engendered up to $7 million to Mr. Cesar Rosen. And that's the amount he laundered into Switzerland, and he agreed to forfeit. So, PDVSA is clearly one of the most corrupt companies around. And we've had some interesting lawsuits filed recently, one here in Houston by a company called Harvest Natural Resources, who claim that because they refused to pay a bribe to PDVSA, PDVSA blocked the sale of a business unit, which caused the company to go out of business. Even more interesting is a lawsuit by an entity called, quote, PDVSA U.S. Litigation Trust, end quote, that is an arm somehow of PDVSA itself, and it claims that the PDVSA individuals, oil trading companies, and banks engaged in a scheme to defraud PDVSA. So certainly in the world of Alan Dershowitz chutzpah, that's probably right up there with one of the top ones. Nevertheless, a lot going on, and I even read this morning that Mike Pence, who's on or just concluded a tour in Latin America, has worked with a group of other countries in Latin America to monitor PDVSA corruption. It's so endemic. And PDVSA is the last sort of gasp of a real international monetary business, money business for the Venezuelan government. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. And one of the questions I raised is this PDVSA trust. One, can they bring the lawsuit? But two, with the sanctions that have been levied on Venezuela, what's going to be the effect on that? All I can say is if your company has done business with PDVSA, you need to bring in affiliated monitors to shake the trees and see if something's going wrong or has gone wrong, or there are any payments. And if you work for Citgo, I'd sure be circulating my resume now.
So, Tom, you also sent me the official release from DOJ. Do you know any of those folks in Houston who are involved with prosecuting this one?
No, I don't know any of the prosecutors personally.
Got it. So our cleanup thing that we want to take a look at comes to us from the Global Anti-Corruption blog, and it's a post from Rick Messick, and it's got a great title: "What Chinese Cuisine and Deferred Prosecutions Have in Common." And as we've been tracking for since the beginning of this year, and I think it even started at the end of 2017, that DPAs, deferred prosecution agreements, are starting to take a nice tour around the world. And in addition to the United Kingdom, France, Argentina, most recently Singapore, also Australia and Canada are all looking on bringing on the mechanism of deferred prosecution agreements as a way to resolve anti-corruption, or actually a way to resolve corruption matters. And the question that Rick Messick posits is, how well is the DPA going to travel around the world? And here in the United States, it's a way to resolve an action, to keep a company in business and keep a company solvent. And the reason most companies agree to a DPA is that they do not want to face a long, lengthy trial with a possibility of losing that trial. And the question that Rick asks is, will other countries' DPAs have enough teeth in them, or will companies be emboldened to go to court and see if they can beat these things? So it's a very short blog, but it's very insightful, and I think it's something we need to take a look at in the coming months. Your thoughts on it?
So, Jay, I guess I thought that the point Rick raised was not simply about going to trial and being successful, but it was even more basic point about the willingness to prosecute. And certainly in the United States, it's viewed as the interest of the United States to fight bribery and corruption of U.S. and other companies that violate the FCPA. His point, I think, was that will other governments feel that same sort of need? Singapore, perhaps has one view, but if you look at Malaysia, I mean, that government is alleged to be as corrupt as that can be. So will a government actually have a real threat of prosecution? Is that threat just a political threat that we'll bring out from time to time and use against a company? I mean, the Chinese have only prosecuted one Western company, although they have aggressively prosecuted Chinese individuals who've engaged in bribery and corruption. The only Chinese prosecution against a Western company was GlaxoSmithKline. So I guess the overall question that I thought Rick correctly raised is, unless you have the willingness to prosecute, and I think he called them psychological and structural factors, will companies be incentivized to essentially self-disclose or self-report? And the answer to that is we don't know at this point. Can you have the incentive of a DPA without a stick behind it? And if you don't have a stick, is anybody going to come in and admit something that they have done when there's not a lot of incentive for them to do so? We posted episode 27 of Everything Compliance, which went up yesterday. And this one was really a lot of fun, a lot more interplay. We were privileged to have Jonathan Armstrong in Houston. And so he and I were together and we had on the phone yourself, Matt, and Mike Volkoff. We had a much more interactive. We took a look at two different topics, the Zuckerberg Facebook testimony, overlaid, of course, with Jonathan's EU, GDPR, Cambridge Analytica thoughts, together with the Michael Cohen subpoena. So Mike Volkoff did a great job of laying out the legal underpinnings of how a attorney can have a search warrant executed on his property. So that's up. I wanted to announce a upcoming webinar. I'm participating with Opus Global and Hyperos on the convergence of anti-corruption compliance and GDPR compliance, which will be next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The event is at no charge, and we're going to link to the registration and additional information in our show notes. And of course, my book is still available for pre-sale. We're still looking at a publication in early May. So I hope you'll check that out. It will certainly be, I think, one of the top single volumes on compliance practitioners, and compliance programs around.
And then, so that Wednesday, April 25th, that is exactly 1 month before GDPR goes live, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I don't know about you, Jay, but I am literally inundated every day with 3 to 5 emails. All are essentially, are you GDPR ready? And advertising a white paper, a webinar, a something that you can do. So we are starting to get overwhelmed with GDPR information. As you know, Jonathan Armstrong and I have had a series this entire year on countdown to GDPR. But if you haven't started to get ready, you really need to begin, because European regulators are going to be looking at American companies for data privacy violations. And the other point that Facebook has really driven home, because it's not clear how much of Facebook will comply with GDPR, but if you have a data breach and you release and you're required to notify regulators in 72 hours in the United Kingdom or the EU, that information is going to get out. So you never have a data breach limited to one geographic area. So if there's a data breach of a large technology company in Europe, it's probably a data breach in the United States. And so these companies that think they're going to hide behind U.S. law or lack of U.S. law, I think are sorely mistaken, and it's going to be just an administrative nightmare for them.
Do you think that they're going to jump right in on this, or is there going to be, a kind of like slow rollout before the first kind of, situations come up?
So Jonathan Armstrong told us that Cambridge Analytica has been under EU investigation for at least a year, maybe longer, back to 2016. So there's some ongoing investigations. And if Facebook does not comply with GDPR, I think regulators in the EU are just literally Pavlovian canine in their desire to go after a U.S. company. And Facebook would probably be one of the first targets. So I think that they have had investigations under the old law. The breaches that may or may not have occurred under the old law will become much more expensive after the go live date. So I really think we're going to have a fairly quick enforcement regime, but it's based upon things that certainly happened before the law changed.
Great, thank you for that feedback. So, in the world of affiliated monitors, my colleague Eric Feldman was in Singapore during the week, and he did a couple presentations to the PSIA, which is the Public Sector Internal Audit Conference. And Eric spoke about how audits become investigations. And then we also had a reception in London with our joint venture partners, RS Legal Strategy. They introduced a new attorney who's joining them, David Kirk, who's coming over from McGuire Woods, and from the affiliated monitor side, Vin DeCiani and Don Stern were representing us. So it looks like they had a great event in London. And I guess we're getting ready for a milestone. If the title is correct, we are episode 99. So next week will be our 100th episode. So almost 2 years on the radio. And Millie and Michaela are working very hard on some ethics and compliance questions that they want to propose to us at the beginning of next week's session. So I'm looking forward to that.
So you want to take us home, Jay?
Sure. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for episode 99, The Bank's Still Behaving Badly edition. This is for the week ending April 20th, 2018. We thank you for joining us for all things ethics, compliance, and FCPA, and we wish you a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can reach me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. You can reach Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the only weekly wrap-up in compliance and ethics on the podcast scene. Stay tuned next week where we have episode 100 with special guest appearances from Millie and Michaela. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed this episode. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.